Okay, today we're going to do 12.4, which is simplifying rational expressions. We're going to first start with talking about what excluded values are. So rational expressions are going to be undefined when the denominator is 0. We know that we can't have anything equal to 0, so we're going to go ahead and exclude those values from our solution set, and we're going to call these values the excluded values. So to find the excluded values, the first thing we need to do is we need to factor the denominator. Once we have factored the denominator, we can go ahead and set the denominator equal to 0. And we can solve using the zero product property. These values will be excluded from our solution. So when we look at number 1 here, we look at the denominator, 2x. There's nothing that we can factor out of 2x, so we're going to just set this equal to 0. We're going to say 2x is equal to 0. And now we can go ahead and solve this equation. Divide both sides by 2 and we get x is equal to 0. This is going to be a little bit backwards now. So when that means when x is equal to 0 and we plug it back in, that the denominator is going to be equal to 0. So our answer, our excluded value, is x cannot equal to 0. Okay, so 0 is our excluded value. Let's look at number 2. We're just looking again at the denominator, and we're setting x minus 3. What value is going to make that 0? We'll add 3, and we'll get that when x is equal to 3, our denominator is 0. So we're going to go ahead and exclude x is equal to 3 from our solution. Okay? Let's look at some where we actually have to factor the denominator. We look at x squared plus 8x plus 15, and we're asking ourselves what values of factors of 15 add up to the 8. So hopefully we're good at this now. X plus 3 times x plus 5. So we factored our denominator. Now we're going to set this equal to 0. We're going to use the zero product property and say that x would be 0, or I'm sorry, the denominator would be 0 when x is equal to negative 3, or our denominator would be 0 when x is equal to negative 5. So our two excluded values are x may not be equal to negative 3 or negative 5. So the answer to the question, what are the excluded values, this is our answer right here, okay? Okay, number 4. We're still having a lot of trouble with this, I know, at least in my class. We're looking at the denominator. How do we factor that? That's a difference of perfect squares. So this is going to factor to x plus 5 and x minus 5. Okay, so we factored it. Now we're going to set it equal to 0. And using our zero product property, we can find out what values will make the denominator equal to 0. And as we're setting both x plus 5 and x minus 5 equal to 0, we see that our excluded values would be negative 5 and 5. So we will conclude that we cannot have our denominator, we cannot have our x value be negative 5 or positive 5. And if you want to write it as positive or negative 5, that's fine. Okay, now we're going to actually start simplifying our rational expressions. And we're going to start with the monomials, which means we have one term on top and one term in the denominator. So the first thing we're looking at is what value would make our denominator equal to 0. So 12 times y to the second. Hopefully you can conclude that y cannot be equal to 0, because if we plug in 0, we're going to have 12 times 0 in the denominator, and we're going to be dividing by 0, which we know we can't do. So then we're going to look and we're going to see what can we simplify. I look at the 4 over 12, and that's going to reduce to 1/3. And I look at y over y to the second, and that's going to reduce to 1 over y. So when I write my simplified answer, my simplified fraction will be just 1 over 3y. And I can write that over here on my answer line. Okay, I'll go ahead and do the same thing for number 6. I'm looking at the part of 6 over negative 18, and that's going to reduce to 1 over negative 3. and then I look at the y to the third over y to the fourth, and that's going to reduce using my exponent rules to 1 over y to the first, or just 1 over y. So when I go ahead and I put my answer together, my simplified answer will be 1 over negative 3y. Now I did forget to talk about the excluded values, and if I look at number 6, it's very similar to number 5. I can also conclude that if y was equal to 0, I would have an undefined fraction, so I'm going to say y cannot be equal to 0. All right, let's go ahead and move on to some more complicated ones. So when we have polynomials, what we're going to do is we are going to first factor both the numerator and the denominator, and then we are going to find the excluded values first. Before you start crossing stuff off and reducing it, you have to first make sure that you find your excluded values. Okay, so then we're going to cross out the common factors. You might want to write yourself a note that these are things that are in parentheses, and we'll kind of talk about that more in class. All right, so let's look at number 7. What's going to be different, we're not just looking for the excluded values, we're going to actually simplify this fraction. So we need to factor the numerator and the denominator. I look at my numerator, x squared minus 3x, and the only thing I can factor is a GCF. So I'm going to factor out x, and then my what's remaining is x minus 3. I look in the denominator, and the only thing I have there is an x minus 3, and there's nothing to factor out. So I'm going to go ahead and leave that, but I'm going to put it in parentheses, okay? And this is going to hopefully make this a little bit easier when we reduce. So we have factored the numerator and the denominator. Now we're going to look at what are my excluded values, okay? So I'm looking here at my excluded values. What is going to make x minus 3 equal to 0? And that's going to be the value x is equal to 3. So I'm going to say that positive 3 is my excluded value. Okay, now I'm looking at this fraction and I'm wondering what it is I can cross off that's both in the numerator and the denominator. And hopefully you're seeing x minus 3 and x minus 3 are going to go ahead and be reduced out. And so all that we're remaining is x. So our simplified answer is just x for this one. Let's go ahead and look at number 8. Again, we look at the numerator and we look at the denominator. We're going to factor out whatever it is we can. So when we look at the numerator for number 8, our GCF of 2x and 8 is 2, and we're going to be left with x plus 4 in parentheses. And I look at the denominator, 5x squared plus 20x. Again, I have a GCF, and my GCF is going to be 5x. So following along on my steps, I'm going to factor, which I've done that. Now I'm going to find the excluded value. So I'm going to set my two factors equal to 0. 5x is equal to 0. So x equals 0 is our first excluded value. And x plus 4 is equal to 0. So my second excluded value is x is equal to negative 4. And so we can write that x cannot be 0 or negative 4 on our excluded values line. And now we can go ahead and look, is there anything in the numerator and the denominator that we can go ahead and reduce? And we hopefully see that we can reduce the x plus 4 and the x plus 4. So my final answer that's reduced is 2 over 5x. Let's move on and try another one. Number 9. I look at number 9 and I'm wondering what it is I can factor out from the numerator. I only have two terms, but remember this is a difference of perfect squares. So I'm going to go ahead and factor my numerator to x plus 5 times x minus 5. And I'm looking at my denominator, x to the second plus 3x minus 10. What factors of negative 10 add up to be 3? And that would go ahead and I'll have x plus 5 and x minus 2. Now before I cross off my common factors, I'm going to go ahead and remember to check for my excluded values. So I'll set each of these portions to 0. X plus 5 is equal to 0. And x minus 2 is equal to 0. So now I have my two excluded values, that x cannot be equal to negative 5 or positive 2. And then my reduced fraction, I'm looking what I can cross off, that's both in the numerator and the denominator. And hopefully we see that the x plus 5 factors reduce out. So our remaining answer is x minus 5 over x minus 2. If you're comfortable to write it like that, you may. If you prefer to leave these in parentheses, you may do so as well. Now, even though we have an x in the numerator and the x in the denominator, we can't get rid of these because they're connected to the 5 and the 2 through addition or subtraction, okay? So we can't just reduce those out, even though we have both an x in the numerator and the denominator. And that's why it's helpful to leave them in parentheses. Let's go ahead and let's do one or two more together, and then we will be done with this for today. So we're looking at x squared minus 6x plus 9. How do I factor that? That's going to factor to what factors of 9 add up to be negative 6. And that's x minus 3 times x minus 3. Typically, I encourage you in class to write that as x minus 3 squared, but I'll show you why we're not going to do that for this particular section. And when I look at my denominator, x squared plus 2x minus 15, those factors will be x plus 5 times x minus 3. So first, again, we factored it. Now we're going to check for our excluded values. So what would make x plus 5 equal to 0 would be negative 5, and what would make x minus 3 equal to 0 would be 3. So my excluded values are negative 5 and positive 3. And now when I'm looking for what I can reduce out, I see that I have an x minus 3 both in the numerator and the denominator. So I cross them off, and now I've reduced them out of our rational expression. There's still an x minus 3 remaining, but we can't get rid of the one in the numerator that remains because we've already eliminated the one that matches it on the bottom. So our final answer is going to be x minus 3 over x minus 5. All right? Let's go ahead, and I just real briefly want to skip over number 11, and we're going to do number 12, okay? So we look at number 12, and we're looking at the numerator, and we're looking what is that there that we can factor out. Now, some of you might want to start doing slide and divide, or just plugging in guessing to do factoring, but let's first take out that GCF of 2. So I factor out the 2, and I'm left with x squared plus 2x minus 6. And in the denominator, I'm just left with the 2. Now let's try and think what factors of negative 6 are going to add up to be 2. So we have 1 and 6 to work with and 2 and 3 to work with. This actually, what's remaining, that trinomial is not factorable. So we're going to actually stop on the factoring, and now we're going to look at the excluded values. And the reason I wanted to finish with this one is because this is slightly different. We look at the denominator, and we have no variable. If we have no variable, there's no number that we're going to plug in that could possibly make it equal to 0. So there are no excluded values, okay? This function is going to have a value at every single value for x, okay? And then when we look as to what we can divide out, what we can simplify, we have this 2 and this 2 that we can get rid of. And so our simplified expression is just going to be what's left in the numerator, x squared plus 2x minus 6. Okay? We're going to spend time in class tomorrow practicing the excluded values, simplifying the monomials, and then simplifying some of the more challenging ones. Now what we'd like you to do is go ahead and try number 11 on your own. See if you can answer the excluded values and if you can simplify this expression. And then go ahead, if there's some questions that you had, go ahead and try and write some real good specific questions down here below. Okay? We'll go ahead and we will see you when we see you.